Hello, students. This is our lesson on cultural relativism. Uh, as you begin to look at this, I'm hoping that you'll be familiar with the assigned reading on this, the essay, The Challenge of Cultural Relativism by James Rachels. What follows here is meant to elaborate on that and expand a little. I can tell in advance that this is going to be one of the few lessons where I come across as a bit opinionated, and decidedly so. As we get into this, I'll try to explain why. But we're getting into this lesson at this early stage mainly because we, meaning me and the author of our reading, want to try to talk you out of a certain point of view, which we fear might run counter to the spirit of the course. It's not to say that we are against cultural relativism in all of its forms, but there are some particular principles associated with it that, as I've said, might be counterproductive to what we want to do here. So we're going to walk through a few key points, analyze a few of the author's arguments to try to pave the way for future progress in this course. As we begin, we'll have to define our subject matter. What is this idea of cultural relativism we'll be discussing in this lesson? It's a bit difficult to pin down. If you look back to your reading, the essay by James Rachels on cultural relativism, you might recall that it can be defined in a number of ways. And what we're looking at here is his list of various ideas very closely related that are associated with this idea of cultural relativism. And I think for our purposes, as we go into this, the one we might want to focus on as sort of a defining principle of cultural relativism might be number 5 here. This one might best sum up the principle that the author of our reading wants to attack. And as we move through this, we'll want to be clear about this. You can make up your own mind about these issues, of course, but the author is very much against this principle that the moral code of a society determines what is right within that society. That is, if the moral code of a society says that a certain action is right, then the action is right, at least within that society. Is that true? Could that be true? That will be one of the big questions that we're going to try to tackle together. Does morality vary across cultures? As a matter of fact, yes. Look around the world, you'll see that other societies, other cultures have ways different from our own. More importantly, if you go to other parts of the world, you'll find people who approve of things we condemn and condemn actions we approve of. So we say, as a matter of fact, there are such differences. Morality does vary across culture. But do standards of right and wrong vary across culture? Consider a few examples of practices where you might see some variation. There are societies, even today, that approve of the practice of polygamy, of having multiple spouses. Our society, for the most part, would condemn that sort of practice. Other societies welcome it. Other societies might find that that is actually the right way to go about it, the right form of marriage. We'll find in other parts of the world a practice of honor killings, where parents might actually kill their own child for having sex out of wedlock, for being raped out of wedlock. A practice most of us would be horrified by, but others, we're told, would say that's the right thing to do under given circumstances. There are societies that have practiced forced abortions. Society is trying to institute measures of population growth control, would, in some cases, actually force people to terminate their own pregnancies as a way of preventing overpopulation. Again, it's hard for us to imagine that sort of thing going on in our own society. So, I'll leave it to you to consider other examples. Can you think of other practices that are widely condemned in our society but are openly practiced in other parts of the world? If you can come up with your own examples, that might help you to get a better sense of what we're dealing with here. It is this next question. does the general acceptance of that practice by a society make it right for that society? So, what we're considering is this proposition. Again, what most cultural relativists would say, the idea that if an activity, if an action is widely performed, if a practice is widely carried out within a society and approved there, then we would have to say that that action is morally right for them. That's another way of putting this ultimate proposition that we want to consider. Can that be correct? Do we want to say that some actions are simply morally wrong for us, but right for another group of people simply because it's their way? Our first question, and it's an important one, is why even take up this topic? Why take up the topic of cultural relativism? Well, the short answer is that if cultural relativism is true, as we'll come to understand it, then there isn't going to be much point to doing pretty much anything that we'll be doing in this course. There won't be much point to attempting to think critically about moral problems because all these supposedly tough questions we'll tackle could be easily answered just by considering our culture. And we'll see what we mean by that as we get a little further in this lesson. So the basic idea, as you can see here, is that we can't defend philosophical approaches to moral problems if morality depends only on cultural traditions and practices. Philosophical argument is meant to challenge, in many instances, those prevailing cultural traditions and majority views. But this could never succeed if what's right and wrong is just always determined by the culture. We're dealing with this topic now, very early on in the course, so that we can set ourselves on a more clear path towards trying to find answers to these difficult moral questions. All right, now that we might have a clearer understanding of what cultural relativism is all about, we move on to our part of the discussion where we consider what's wrong with it, or at least what does the author of our reading, James Rachels, think is wrong with it. Well, as I've suggested, he wants to talk us out of being cultural relativists. It's not to say that the idea has no merit whatsoever, but he wants to say that there are good reasons not to believe that what is morally right and wrong is simply determined by what a society believes, what its moral code holds. How does he go about that? He takes a couple of approaches, and here we're going to consider the first of the two. His first step is to argue that a certain line of argument used to support relativism simply doesn't work. That argument is invalid. You read about the ideas of validity and invalidity in one of the introductory sections of our textbook. Again, to say that an argument is invalid is to say that the premise of the argument or the premises do not provide sufficient logical support for the conclusion. And he's going to say that's what's going on with a very common line of argument. That's the first approach. The second one takes it a step further, and we'll get to that shortly. So let's consider what we have here. We see that Rachel singled out one argument in support of cultural relativism, and it is this one. Again, this is material that's taken from your reading. We have an argument here, a premise. Different cultures have different moral codes, and a conclusion that there is no objective truth in morality. Right and wrong are only matters of opinion, and opinions vary from culture to culture. And that sort of conclusion, if that were true, that would help to lay the groundwork for this bigger relativist conclusion that, in fact, what's right or wrong is simply determined by the culture. So the next question is, how does Rachels address this argument? So what's wrong with this so-called cultural differences argument, you might ask? Well, Rachels answers this question by comparing the argument to a similar one, and you'll see them here. This here is the argument from our previous screen. Sorry for the small type. Then we have a second argument, and you'll see it's about an entirely different subject matter. But the important point is, these two arguments are said to have the same form. And that means that if one of these arguments is invalid, then the other one is invalid at all as well. So let's look at the second one. Now we're told different cultures have different beliefs about the shape of the planet, our planet, Earth. Therefore, there is no objective truth about the shape of a planet. Whether Earth is round or flat is just a matter of opinion, and opinions vary from culture to culture. How ridiculous is that? That's the point. So maybe there is some isolated culture in some other part of the world where most, if not all, people there actually believe that the Earth is flat. Do we want to take away from that there is no fact of the matter? That the Earth is either round or flat, depending on where you live? No. People have different beliefs, and depending on where you live, you'll encounter different opinions about it. But those opinions don't affect the way things are. And if we wouldn't accept the conclusion in that second argument, why should we accept it in the first? So, since the second argument is clearly invalid and it has the same form as the first argument, the first one is invalid as well. That's the takeaway from this. Now, a very common objection here, let me try to nip this in the bud, say, well, the subject matter is different. And suppose there is something special about morality that makes it a matter of opinion. And it still could very well vary from culture to culture. Now, this is a very important point. This conclusion here about objective truth and morality, or the lack thereof, still very well might be true. We haven't ruled that out yet. The reading we've considered hasn't ruled that out yet. All we can say at this point, given what we've discussed, is that this conclusion about whether there's objective truth and morality does not follow from this premise. So there would have to be a better argument for this conclusion. We haven't seen that yet. So we'll have to leave it at that, and then move on to the next step in the argument, in the case against accepting cultural relativism. Now that the author has refuted this one argument, the cultural differences argument we just discussed, he wants to move on to the next step. He's shown that cultural relativists seem to be lacking a good reason for their relativist principle, but that doesn't mean the principle is wrong. Just because you can't support a claim with an argument does not mean the claim is false. So he wants to go a step further. And in one sense, you might take him to be arguing that this relativist claim is false here, but maybe he can't quite get that far. Rather, what he wants us to do is talk us out of a claim. Perhaps he can't prove that it's false, but he wants to at least prove that believing in relativism carries consequences that you're unlikely to be willing to accept. If he's wrong, and you happen to be comfortable with these consequences, so be it. He will not be able to convince you that relativism is wrong. And we're looking at them right here. These are the three that he outlines. We'll discuss them with more emphasis on the second two of these, numbers 2 and 3. Keep in mind that you'll be working on an assignment related to this, so there'll be a different opportunity to explore this, but we can discuss it a bit here. Moving on to the second one, first of all, we could decide whether actions are right or wrong just by consulting the standards of our own society. Again, the basic idea is that this is something you have to believe if you believe in relativism. So, if you can't accept this, if you can't accept that we could decide whether actions are right or wrong just by consulting the standards of our society, then you would need to reject relativism. That's his hope anyway. So, consider what's suggested here. We could decide whether actions are right or wrong just by consulting our own standards. That would be to say that something that is frowned upon to a significant degree in our society ought to be considered morally wrong. Uh, if it's not the case now, you'd only need to go back a few years to consider the issue of gay marriage. And not too long ago, there was a time where much, if not most, of society was against that practice. Well, if you take relativism seriously, then the point is you would have to come to the conclusion that for our society, gay marriage is wrong. And that's the end of it. Now, if that leaves you uncomfortable, if you want to think, well, can't we have a discussion about this? Maybe there are good reasons to think that most of us are actually wrong on this issue. Well, you wouldn't have a leg to stand on. And there's yet another unacceptable consequence. The idea of moral progress is called into doubt. What's meant by this? Well, consider a change in our history, such as the abolition of slavery. I think many of us would regard that as a change for the better, a mark of moral progress for our society. A change, and a good one. But the argument is, if relativism is true, then there are no grounds for saying that. There are no grounds for regarding the abolition of slavery as a mark of moral progress. If at one time slavery was widely accepted by the society, if the culture approved of it, and then someday came to think differently about it, we could only say it's a change, but not one for the better, and not one for the worse, for that matter. In order to say that this change were changing for the better, we would have to have some sort of objective standard by which we could compare these two societies. And this is an important thing to take note of. As we're considering relativism now, we're not talking about two societies in two different parts of the world today, but we're talking about a society at one point in time compared to its an earlier version of it sometime before. And we face the same problem there. We don't have an objective criteria, as the relativists say we don't, to compare the two. And for lack of such a criteria, we have no basis for comparing one society to another, even one society that develops into another over time. So again, what the author James Rachels wants to say here is that if you believe in relativism, then you should be committed to the view that the abolition of slavery was not a change for the better, not a mark of moral progress. And if you can live with that, so be it. But he's guessing that you don't. He's hoping that, in fact, you would want to hold to the view that the abolition of slavery was a good thing and a mark of moral progress. But if you do, then you can't take relativism seriously. And that pretty much sums up his strategy, his approach to talking us out of cultural relativism. Now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to pile on myself just a little bit and go through a few more considerations. Some of these might be hinted at in the essay, but I'd like to try to elaborate on them. I take these to be additional reasons for rejecting relativism, and I'll walk through them somewhat quickly. One problem I have personally with the relativist position is that many relativist arguments reach a conclusion that actually contradicts their underlying view. If many relativists argue that we ought to leave other societies alone, leave other cultures alone, not tell them what to do, not impose our own views on them, we should recognize that, in a way, that represents a universal principle in its own right. This principle that we ought to express tolerance towards all other cultures, that is a universal principle. Given that it's supposed to hold for us, no matter what our own society happens to believe, it's supposed to hold for all societies, regardless of what their moral codes hold. There's a further problem. Relativism might be difficult to apply because many of the concepts that it trades in are notoriously difficult to define. Notice when we considered the principle earlier, the idea that's what is right or wrong is determined by the culture of the society you're in. We were making quite a few assumptions that we could understand what a society is. What society do you live in? Is your society the United States of America? Is there a moral code that society embodies? Or is your society Virginia or whatever other state you're taking this course from? Is Richmond, Virginia your society, if you live there? In fact, I live in all those places. Is that to say that I belong to different societies? Depending on my perspective, I might find, well, Richmond, Virginia has a culture that can't be generalized to the wider region or the country. So in fact, I'd be hard pressed to say what my society's moral code is. Relativism, furthermore, tells us very little about what happens when different societies come into conflict. Going back to our original point, it's a fair question. Is there any particularly good moral reason, from a relativist point of view, for one country not to conquer another, to enslave another? We have these two moral codes that are each supposed to govern their respective societies, but no moral code that would seem to dictate how those two societies should interact with each other. Let's consider one more point. Relativism is attractive as an ideal to a number of people, and there's a suggestion that it seems all the more attractive because it's easily misunderstood. Relativism does have some appeal in that it preaches tolerance, toleration, restraint. That's to say, don't go off trying to conquer every culture whose views seem barbaric to you. Maybe we don't understand them. Use restraint when interacting with other countries, other societies, other cultures. Maybe these are good practices, but the suggestion is you don't necessarily need to be a relativist to appreciate them. That is to say, maybe we can be tolerant, maybe we can use restraint, maybe we can respect other cultures without being relativists. Keeping in mind that toleration involves not necessarily approving of what you see. You can tolerate something even if you don't like it. The relativist, on the other hand, wants to say that if a practice is accepted within a given culture, then it's right for them. So if I accept that, it wouldn't be that I'm tolerating what's going on over there. It would have to be that I actually approve of it on some level to say that it's right for them. But we don't necessarily have to feel that way. By the same token, there are lots of reasons to exercise restraint. We have to recognize, practically speaking, we can't always meddle in other people's affairs. There are lots of good reasons not to interfere. And we can recognize those without going so far as to say that we're in no position to judge, which is precisely what the relativist wants to say. So the takeaway here is that you can reject relativism while still embracing many of these certainly good qualities. We can be tolerant, we can be respectful, without going so far as to say that, on some level, it's all good. One last matter before we conclude our discussion of relativism. If you did the reading, you might be wondering, what was the point of that discussion about the Eskimos? If you recall, they explain how some Eskimo groups had a practice of leaving some of their firstborn out in the elements to die. And the suggestion at first was that this was an example of cultural differences, in fact, an example of a moral difference. That if their society is willing to do this and we're not, then that says something very profound about us in terms of morals and ethics, that there's something we value and they don't. And that is supposed to support that cultural differences argument that you know, underlie that basic premise that if different societies have different moral codes, then that gets the ball rolling with making the case for relativism. But Rachel's takes up this discussion, the one entitled Why There Is Less Disagreement Than It Seems, in order to suggest that, in fact, maybe that basic premise is not true all the time. That, in fact, as different as the Eskimos seem from us, given that they do this sort of thing that we don't, maybe they aren't as different. How could that be? How is it that a society that actually commits infanticide on a regular basis is not altogether different from ours? Well, we have to consider the background conditions. That's the argument. The idea that this Eskimo group lives in a different place, they have different resources, fewer of them, to be precise. In fact, you might consider them to be in a desperate situation much of the time. Desperate that they can contemplate things that we wouldn't do, but only because we don't have cause to do them. If we lived in such extreme circumstances where our society stood on the brink of starvation, if our population came slightly out of balance, then we very well might feel the need to do that sort of thing. So, going back to some of the details there, recall he explains that they kill a fair number of their female infants because if they don't, the proportion of the ratio of females to males by age of maturity will be too far out of balance, such that there won't be enough hunters to feed the group. And because males die at a greater rate throughout those earlier years. So this is, rightly or wrongly, regarded as a matter of necessity. It's a matter of survival for them. So you have to ask, in our own society, if circumstances changed such that the survival of our entire society depended on us making these sorts of sacrifices, would we do it? Well, he wants to suggest maybe. And if that's the case, then in fact, we're not as different. So to sum up, this is to say that maybe our values are not that different, perhaps no different at all than those of the Eskimos. But we find ourselves in different circumstances, and so different values come into play. Or to put another way, the values we have come into play in a certain way. If he is correct, then, in fact, morals do vary less than one might think, and that further weakens the case for relativism. So, we've considered a number of arguments, a number of issues related to this. Again, the agenda in this lesson, unlike many others we'll go through, has been a bit biased. In a way, my objective was to try to talk you out of relativism, or at the very least to keep an open mind to alternatives to it. Now, a very common reply at this point, and certainly a fair point, so you're saying relativism is wrong. Does that mean that some sort of absolute principle holds? You might take that as a suggestion. That's not to say we know what it is, but that will be an important step for us as we really get going with the course to try to see if there really are any potential candidates for some sort of absolute principle, some sort of universal principle of right or wrong. If we could discover such a thing, that might help us to resolve any number of moral problems. But just because we have reason to think that relativism is wrong doesn't mean that we have to commit ourselves right away to a certain absolute principle. Just because we know that a certain approach to studying morality is wrong doesn't mean that we have to present the right alternative right away. That will be one of the main purposes of this course as we continue to ask big questions. So, thank you for listening. Good luck with the assignment related to this, and we'll talk soon.